Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us for Wordplay 2020. I'm Len, the incoming Executive Director at Hand-Eye Society. Just briefly, Hand-Eye Society is a Toronto-based not-for-profit serving the game curious through exhibition, opportunities, mentorship, and so on. We see video games as a form of creative expression, and we want to invite as many people into the space as possible. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can go to handeyesociety.com or follow us on Twitter at Hand-Eye Society. Below you'll find a link to our community Discord where you can chat about the games or the talks during Wordplay or join our community more generally. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who helped Wordplay 2020 happen, with a big shout out going to Ontario Creates. Without them, Wordplay couldn't have happened. So, from kissing aliens to eating buildings, we hope that you enjoyed the games and the talks that we've curated for you. You can find the entire Wordplay itinerary at handeyesociety.com. I want to say thank you to Rakashi as Festival Director, Jordan Sparks as Technical Director, Aaron Demeter as Volunteer Coordinator, and all of the different Hand-Eye Society staff and volunteers who helped make Wordplay happen. We hope that you enjoy the festival, and we'll see you online.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Wordplay. I'm Rakashi, I'm Festival Director for this year's event. We have some amazing speakers for this year's festival, and we're so excited to be able to showcase incredible games and game makers from various disciplines. Wordplay is Hand-Eye Society's free 2-day festival, celebrating the most interesting uses of writing and words in contemporary games. Each year, there will be a curated game space, talks about creators, about the craft, and ways for the public to get interested in making games as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that the Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today's talks features Josh LaBelle, Salivir Nelson Jr., and Drav Jani. Please don't forget to check out the showcase games on handeyesociety.com/wordplay. Support them, follow them, and play their games. We hope you enjoy today's talks, and see you soon.
The last day I ever played Dungeons & Dragons with Sam Watson was January 1st, 2019. And on that day, I gave Sam probably the greatest gift that an adventurer can give their dungeon master. I did something extremely foolish. We were in the Dripping Caves, just a mile north of Nightstone, and I stuck my arm into a stalagmite and was beset by a noxious ooze monster. He got that look on his face, the look that dungeon masters sometimes get, and he reached for just a metric shitload of dice to roll for damage. I'm really glad that I got to have that one last great game with Sam before we lost him. Hi, my name's Josh LaBelle. I'm a writer and a narrative designer, and I make interactive fiction. Some of my work includes Tavern Crawler, a 65,000-word text adventure about what happens after you slay the dragon, and Sentry, an interactive short story where you find out how long you'd last as a Facebook content moderator. But the most important thing about me for the purposes of this talk, I play tabletop role-playing games. In fact, I started creating interactive fiction to try and recreate that feeling that I got sitting around the table with friends rolling dice. Like a lot of people, I originally got into tabletop through Dungeons & Dragons. On the day of that final game with Sam, my group had been playing together for almost 4 years. I can safely say that no one could ask for a better friend or DM than Sam Watson. Sam brought a sense of generosity to everything he did, and the amount of preparation that he put into our campaign constantly astounded me. Together, we'd fought eldritch monsters, destroyed a whole city with a bag of magic beans, and fought our way through countless brilliantly constructed encounters. One thing we weren't prepared to face was losing our dungeon master when Sam died. I promise I'm not here just to tell you about my great D&D campaign, which can sometimes be a little bit like having someone try to explain a weird dream that they had to you. And I'm also not here to make everybody really depressed. Instead, I want to tell you about how when Sam died, we used tabletop role-playing games to bring us back together, and in a very real way, how they helped us process our grief. Indeed, I want to affirm that tabletop role-playing, at its best, doesn't have to be just about going into caves and murdering things for gold. At its best, gaming can be a space where we process and explore difficult emotions together, where we limn the boundaries of self and other and of individual and community, where we create meaning together. The first time we played without Sam was about a month after he passed. When Sam passed away, we as a group inherited a lot of his role-playing stuff, his books, his dice, physical things that tied us to Sam even still. We decided that when we got together to divvy them up, we would play a game. Nobody knew exactly how this was going to work. It was the first time we were playing without Sam. What does a group do when they don't have their dungeon master? So we decided to play a game without a DM, without any game master at all. A way of honoring Sam, of keeping a seat at the table for him, and a way of centering each of us equally. We chose Avery Alder's The Quiet Year for that first game. For a long time we were at war with the Jackals. Now, finally we've driven them off, and we're left with this, a year of relative peace. One quiet year with which to build our community up and learn again how to work together. Come winter, the Frost Shepherds will arrive and we might not survive the encounter. This is when the game will end. But we don't know about that yet. What we know is that right now, in this moment, there is an opportunity to build something. The Quiet Year is a game where you collectively play as a community, rebuilding in the aftermath of a calamity. On each player's turn, they draw cards from a deck to represent each week in the Quiet Year. 52 cards in a deck, 52 weeks in a year. Each card asks you to make a decision about the fate of your community, a decision about what's important to you. And as you play together, you draw a map to represent your community and the decisions you've made. Since there's no GM, you all collectively create the fiction. It's not just a game about building a community, its rules teach you how to work together as one. When something happens that causes enmity in the community, you take a contempt token to symbolize the disagreement. Players can hold discussions, asking questions about what we want out of our community. In these discussions, players trade off roles, speaking for different factions and characters. Each person weighs in with just one short point or an answer to a question that's been raised. Tensions are brought up and left hanging to be answered in play. With the lines of authorial intent blurred, trust becomes important.
And look, this dispute was settled fairly, and so Jerry and Eddie are still good friends, just as they always were.
Playing The Quiet Year showed us a different way to play. In a time when we were wandering in uncharted territory, a game where you draw a map turned out to be exactly what we needed. Now, with everything I've said, you might assume that this game was a kind of quiet, somber affair. But in fact, we told a story together about post-apocalyptic cotton candy factories and a violent struggle with the Frito-Lay Corporation. This is the map that we drew. It was about rediscovering the joy and silliness and making each other laugh again. Why did playing together help us so much, and why is tabletop such an ideal place to collectively process emotion? Human beings process things together through ritual. The theme of this year's festival is empty words, and let me tell you, you never hear more empty words than when you've just lost someone you care about. He's in a better place. Do you need anything? How are you holding up? And while all these words are well-intentioned, they're just that, words. In the aftermath of Sam's death, feeling bereft of meaning and needing some reminder of what life is all about, I stopped in at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I just wandered around for a couple of hours looking at all the paintings and sculptures. It happened to be the day they were running this exhibit about grieving rituals around the world. There was actually an interactive component to this where you were supposed to write a little message to someone you'd lost and stick it in a box. So I wrote a message to Sam. And as I was doing it, it suddenly struck me that this wasn't unlike playing tabletop. The little pencil they gave you and the paper all kind of felt like tabletop. Looking around at all the rituals from around the world, it kind of struck me that the closest thing to some of these things I could think of was tabletop. getting around the table with your grimoires and your dice and your miniatures, all these little artifacts, these physical bits of ritual. The dungeon master presiding from behind their screen like a high priest. It occurred to me that this is one of the things maybe we don't have enough of right now. Collective ritual. If we let it, maybe this can be a space that tabletop can fill. Tabletop is an ideal space for learning to talk to each other. Tabletop role-playing games are ultimately conversations. Conversations with rules, but still conversations.
There are rules for playing games and many other kinds of rules. If we know and obey the rules, many disputes can be settled quickly and fairly.
Playing them can help us learn how to be attentive to one another's needs, to feel out the kind of game we all want to play with one another. Games that don't have GMs in particular can be great lessons in communication. With no one playing referee, paying attention to the mood of everyone at the table becomes itself a core game mechanic. Seeing what's exciting for the person across the table, seeing what's going to be fun, seeing when people are getting bored. By allowing us to take on new roles, tabletop can help us feel out who we really are.
The best thing I know for breaking the ice and getting people acquainted is some good mixer games.
Every single character I've played in a tabletop game is some aspect of me that I would never indulge in my regular life. There's the bard, who's super egotistical, just a total egomaniac. That's not a part of me that I would ever hopefully indulge in real life, but it's there. There's the tiefling warlock, who's super brash and impulsive, and if there's a button in the room, she's gonna press it. That's a part of me that I hope I don't indulge in my day-to-day life, but it's there. I think that's part of what's so fun about playing tabletop. You see all those sides of people you know, but maybe don't know as well as you thought you did. You find out that that shy person has this side of them where they want to be this charisma dynamo. That super quiet and unassuming girl wants to be an orc barbarian who rips people's heads off. In fact, I'm going to make a bold claim here and say you really don't know someone until you see the characters that they play in D&D. If you're going to use tabletop to try to explore difficult topics, I have a few pieces of advice for you. Look beyond Dungeons and Dragons. I feel like that could be the secret subtitle of this talk. Before I played The Quiet Year, the idea of a tabletop role-playing game where you didn't roll dice, where you didn't have a GM, where you didn't even have defined characters, was wild to me. But getting beyond those beliefs freed me up so much. Look, I love Dungeons & Dragons. I have D20s tattooed on my forearm, but Dungeons & Dragons sprung out of wargaming. It has a lot of rules for armor class, or what a mace does to a goblin's face. And a lot fewer rules for dealing with emotions, or story, or power dynamics between players.
We call this way of settling a dispute a compromise.
And that's not even to get into all the issues with Dungeons & Dragons and race and its core mechanics encouraging a kill stuff and plunder playstyle.
Well, let's go to the library and get some good magazines and books and find some really good games.
Oh, terrific.
I'll do that. Oh, good.
I recommend branching out into games by independent creators, particularly independent creators who are from marginalized communities, people who have done thinking around these problems with D&D and maybe added stuff to their games that are intended as solutions. I highly recommend trying out some Powered by the Apocalypse games. A good one to start with is Monster Hearts by Avery Alder. Monster Hearts uses a lot of understandable supernatural teen drama tropes, and it's fun and fast, but it has rules directly related to the power dynamics between players and characters and their emotions. Another game you might try is Masks by Brendan G. Conway. That's a game that uses superhero tropes to explore big teenage emotions. Next piece of advice is establish expectations and psychological safety practices. That didn't sound very fun, but I promise it is in service of making the game fun for everyone.
Whether it's a special carnival designed for gay entertainment, or a game party in a home, a birthday party, a holiday party, they all take planning, and they should all be fun.
Especially if you're going to be messing around with big, difficult, weighty issues, communication is hugely important. Establishing psychological safety mechanisms also is important for just kind of setting a tone around the table of respect and safety. What do I mean by psychological safety tools? Well, that could actually be a whole talk on its own, so I won't go super in-depth into it. The most popular one for tabletop is the X card. This is a card that you just hold up, has an X on it. If something's happened in the game that's upset you or that's made you uncomfortable, you hold it up, no questions asked. Things can rewind before whatever happened, and you can move past it. Now, that said, there is some criticism of the X card because some people who have trauma in their background don't find that hard pause approach to be what they need in a moment where they've had a trigger touched on. I think it all comes back to communication. Talk to the people in your game, see what everybody's going to need. Maybe all they want is a simple X card mechanism, or maybe all they even need is just the knowledge that if something happens that they're not cool with, it's totally fine to rewind. I had one dungeon master. He would always establish at the beginning of every session, if something happens that you're not cool with, I've sent you all my phone number, send me a text message, let me know, hey, I wasn't cool with that, no questions asked, we'll rewind. And though we never actually used that mechanism, knowing it was there was really helpful in making everyone at the table feel welcome. And my final piece of advice, communicate expectations and check in after each session. Before starting a campaign, talk about the kind of game you want to play.
Now listen, this is what we have to plan. A guest list, invitations, refreshments, and entertainment.
Have a zero session where you talk about the characters and create them. I can honestly say that every game where I've played a zero session, that's been one of the best sessions of the entire game because we just get to create the characters and figure out where the tensions are between them. Is there material we want to avoid, material we want to lean into? And that can range from identifying stuff that might be upsetting to stuff that's more like tone. Do we all want to play a super silly game where we get in a war with the Frito-Lay's company in the post-apocalypse? Or do we want a very serious game with airtight world building? Steal a concept from the game Microscope by Ben Robbins and create a palette before you start the game. That's basically a list of what you want in the game and what you don't want. So maybe you want lots of creepy, spooky stuff and less silly stuff. Maybe you want lots of silly stuff and no creepy, spooky stuff. It can also be good in here to throw stuff on there like no sexual violence or no parental abuse. If those are things that are going to make a game less fun for you, you can just from the get-go put it on the palette as things that you don't want to have to engage with in this game. After each session, check in with all the other players. Introduce some standard end-of-session conversation questions that you can ask and explore while you're leveling up and looking at your inventory and getting your character sheets in order. What parts of the game got you really excited and made you want to play more? Which parts of the game did not get you excited and you would maybe be happy if there was a little less of in the campaign?
Leave on time and courteously, too, thanking your host sincerely for the good time you've had. All these things help to make a good party, a party that's fun for all.
So to go back to the title of this talk and that quote from the beginning of The Quiet Year, every time you get together around a table with friends, it's an opportunity to build something. And I hope you'll take advantage of that opportunity to explore some things in tabletop that go a little bit beyond armor class and smashing faces in with a mace. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I dedicate this talk to Sam Watson and to anyone out there who maybe doesn't think that they can start a tabletop group, doesn't think that they can be a GM or a facilitator. You definitely can. Sam was such an evangelist for tabletop games, and I hope that you'll all pick it up and run with it for him and for me. Thank you very much. You can find me at Josh M. LaBelle on Twitter. Thanks for listening to the talk.
I can't do this anymore.
Nothing I can do to change your mind.
Now you are welcome to try. I believe I made myself clear.
You know, I feel like we've had this conversation a couple of times now, and you still don't seem to get that I'm done with this line is just gonna look really silly at the end of the day.
Wow, this tastes like a wonderful winter day where you step out on your porch and smell the aghast snow and pine train tracks.
Hello, Wordplay. My name is Oliver Nelson Jr. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see y'all again after, I think this will be the third straight year that I've done a talk or a game or something with the Hand-Eye Society. And y'all are the coolest, so it's an honor to be here again. I am a narrative director and creative professional in video games and beyond, for those who don't know me already. I'm going to change a quick piece of my setup. Live. Actually, no, I'm not, because I don't know how to disable my mouse cursor. You might see it pop up occasionally. Hello. So, you might know me from my work on Skatebird, an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, Hypnospace Outlaw, Frog Fractions 3, the upcoming, or it should be released by the time this talk comes out actually, Reigns Beyond, the new space-themed Reigns game, Candra's Prey, literally dozens of titles. I had a big old roll on them. I love what I do. You might also know me from my work in journalism. I have bylines pretty much everywhere, including a 2-year stint as a columnist for PC Gamer magazine, the print edition. It was really cool. I also do tabletop stuff, including having made my own accessible system called Ellipses RPG. Also, I work in comics because I work in comics now. People seem to really like them as well. In the before times, I would also go around the world giving talks, running strange games where, for example, I wore a mask of Jeff Goldblum or Tom Selleck, or a giant, I think we called it the goat pole. I'm not sure if there's any other better way to describe it. But either way, I would jet around the place, doing strange things, giving talks, and generally trying to be an insightful, eccentric human being. And the title of today's talk is Self-Funding Smaller, Better Games. It's a topic that I'm deeply passionate about. And if you get anything out of this talk by its end, I hope that it's to see this thing, which sounds scary. Self-funding, making things smaller. How the heck does that also make it better? I hope that this entire premise goes from potentially seeming like the most risky route you could take with your game development creation to being one of the most certain and compelling routes for making games across a lifetime. Hopefully you end up questioning why we aren't already doing this more already. And to jump into the meat of this talk, I think it's worth pointing out that no advice is universal, including my own or even other advice that claims to be. We're in an industry that is in many ways built upon inequality. People who make tiny queer twine games will be standing side by side next to folks who have made literally millions of dollars before they've exited their teens. When you have the person who has made millions of dollars on a stage at some place like GDC, delivering advice from on high about this is how to make games, this is how to be like me, regardless of privilege, regardless of elements of luck and fortune and chance that go into anything like that, it is so worth acknowledging even the implicit privileges that we face that mean that no advice is universal. For my business and my way of working, to keep the lights on, I collaborate with other developers on their games, sometimes in very involved capacities, such as with Skatebird or Hypnospace Outlaw, as well as do contracting. I do game development and general creative things full-time, and doing that work for hire stuff keeps the lights on because I want to make sure that my creative practices for my personal games are as sustainable as possible. And if they all crash and burn in some horrific manner, hopefully they don't, and they shouldn't by all rights, based off of the things I've done. But if they do, I'll still be able to keep the lights on. Most people don't do creative pursuits full-time. Most people don't do it in a semi-independent capacity full-time. Most people can't go out and get a contracting job if they need to make up a cash flow problem. And I want to very explicitly state that privilege up front, that I do this full-time before getting into the meat of this talk. However, I want to spin it around also and point out that the entire reason this talk is being delivered, and the entire reason I am so passionate about this, is because I want to detach notions of making something full-time with participating in a creative medium. The idea that the only valid level of creativity is that you have quit your job and that you have risked everything to make your creative pursuits possible, I think is an inherently toxic one. And part of the reason that I believe that is the case is because I spent years as a journalist and now as a developer hearing the quiet stories of all the people who fail. The failure is a strong term, but it's telling, I think, how much the indie dream is still presented as the single primary model of success. Even if you're in AAA, people working on the next Assassin's Creed still dream of making a Cuphead, a Fez, a Super Meat Boy, a Braid, an Among Us. These things are termed as instant hits, sudden breakouts, inevitable in hindsight. When, in cases like Among Us, that is a game that came out 2 years ago that has had this incredible stroke of luck, and that people are even now creating entire business plans around following, around being inspired by, and around believing that this primary concept of laying everything on the line and it all turning out is the way to be creative. That isn't true. I would say that more so than ever, we're seeing more people hit the proverbial jackpot. But even if you have 3 dozen people in a year hitting the big jackpot, putting everything on the line, sacrificing family, or at least putting up the opportunity to sacrifice their family, their psychological, mental, and physical health, and their finances, and succeeding, even if we have more winners relatively than ever, the proportions of those people to the now hundreds and thousands of developers who are making games is minuscule. Betting on this is inherently unsustainable, and it typically relies on risking yourself. The narrative is they did everything. They tried everything. They remortgaged their homes. And what emerged out of it was an inevitable successful dream. That is one model of game development which is put forward again and again and again, no matter how much it might actually be feasible for the vast majority of audiences hearing it. In a similar regard, big thing that's discussed about, that's praised, that's universally recommended, is getting a publishing deal. And developers typically want 6 things from a publisher. They want funding, they want marketing, they want localization, they want porting, they want QA, and they want legal support. These are all incredibly important things to have. However, when you get these things from a publisher as a developer, this comes at a different cost, not necessarily a massive risk to yourself, although it can also be accompanied by this, but to a massive risk for your project. Because yeah, you're getting funding and marketing and porting and localization and QA and legal support, and it benefits the publisher just as much as you to have your game available on multiple platforms in multiple languages and to actually be talked about by people. But the costs for attaining that support go into something that's called recoup. It is essentially debt. If you receive all-inclusive $200,000 to make a video game. That's the marketing budget, that's your launch trailer, that's how much you spent making the game a reality, putting it out on Steam on the day it launches. Before you make a dime, typically, depending on the deal that you're signing, you have to make up a $200,000 bet you've essentially made against the success of the game. I bet that my game is going to make more than $200,000. And that's going to do it in enough time that it will pay me for post-launch support and fixing bugs and adding more to the game, and also just pay me in general. That isn't a guarantee either. And the naughty little secret is that it always has been. Creativity is so inherently a risk when you're making commercial art, which is what we're doing. It is always at the risk of the day that you announce your project or launch it, some news item comes up about Cyberpunk 2077 being delayed and sucks all the air out of the room. That can happen regardless of whether you have $200,000 from a publisher in your hands or if you've mortgaged your house. It has happened to people who I've known who are no longer in this industry anymore, or who have now faced a situation where they are significantly impaired in following their creative dreams. We just don't hear those stories because they're depressing. And because the question is then raised, well, how do we make things then? And this is why I think it's worth talking about our definition of success. The reason why people still say commit everything, try for the indie dream, get a publisher, sacrifice your home potentially. The reason people still commit to that pursuit year after year after year is because the amounts of money compared to a tiny game, a small experiment, something made on a sustainable scale is potentially exponential. If you're making an Undertale, you're making... So I directed a project called Can Androids Pray. It's labeled pizza money because that is basically what we made on it. It did, as far as how it was built, I directed the project, I wrote it, and governed its development. I made that alongside Natalie Clayton, who is a fantastic Scottish games journalist and creator. And our budget was essentially our time in a very part-time capacity over basically a year, and paying musician and sound designer Priscilla Snow. Priscilla Snow is great. If you get the chance to work with them, you are in an incredibly positive position because they're fantastic. With that in mind, when it came out, it made back its money pretty dang quickly, and someone new somewhere in the world buys Can Androids Pray every few days. We've now since ported it to several platforms, working with the publisher / porting house / development studio, A Priori Digital, and it just kind of exists, chugging along, getting a sale here and there, and that isn't something you could quit your job off of, or at least it isn't something that you should quit your job off of. But the amount of money involved and the sustainability of it, we don't have to do any further work for that money anymore, basically. And we have pizza money. I don't think about maintaining a Netflix subscription or freak out about when my Amazon Prime is going to renew. I define success as the things that you no longer have to worry about, because being around very wealthy people and hearing the things that they just consider as commonplace kind of blew my mind. When you're talking about flights and hotels to exotic locations, getting the newest piece of technology on day one, or just being able to effortlessly replace it if something bad happens, that's a pretty good marker of success. Success is what you don't have to worry about. And in the case of Can Androids Pray, sometimes you don't have to worry about pizza or getting an Xbox Game Pass subscription. And I personally feel, I'm going to sort of expose the lead instead of burying it, I feel that people deserve as many chances to get small opportunities to worry about less things as possible, especially when the world is on fire. You can make lots of money making something for exponentially longer periods of time, such as Undertale, which took a while to develop, or investing a massive amount of money and marketing budget into a thing. Undertale probably makes in a day more than Can Androids Pray has made across its lifetime on all platforms. Marvel's Spider-Man, with that leap in development budget and marketing budget, makes more in a day than Undertale has likely made in its lifetime, as successful as Undertale has been and will be. And Grand Theft Auto 5 makes, in basically an hour, enough money to literally sicken you. It's it's an exponential equation. And that's why we make the big bets to get a piece of that right side of the chart. Thing is, what if we weren't all chasing the gobsmacking amounts of money, the amount of money that is literally sickening to consider, and the equivalent risk that comes with it? What if we were making our games more sustainably? What if more of us had the opportunity to have a little project out there that's making pizza money? Not quitting our day jobs, not risking our lives, but having creativity as a piece of the way in which we live and a piece of financial stability in a capitalist environment, which means sometimes you can just get a pizza and not worry about it and not affect the course of your entire life. As a piece of quick math, I want to challenge you to think about something. If you, as a human being, let's say you've got kids, you've got utilities, you've got rent, you're a human being who has to live in a capitalist society. Congratulations. At the end of a given month, let's say you can put away $20. You pay for all the things you need to, you have your Netflix subscription, and even putting a little bit into savings, you still have about $20 left over. And that feels minuscule and tiny. Well, after the course of a year, you'd have roughly $240. And while everyone is chasing the right side of the scale, you weren't thinking about that. You're thinking about stable, sustainable creativity. You're thinking about, maybe if you're American, working at a full-time job so that you have health care while the world is on fire. With that in mind, you put away $20 a month, and you consider, what's the best game I can make for $240? What's the game that only I can make for $240, considering my skill set, the things I know, the people I know, and the things I can purchase on the Unity Asset Store, or whatever your asset store of choice may be. You price it at $5. It takes about a year to develop. You're making it alongside living a life, and you would like to be doing this full time, but you don't. Instead, you remain sustainable. For lack of a better term, you remain healthy. You figure out the type of game you're going to make, you scope tightly and efficiently and make something focused. You bring it to light. You pay the $100 fee for Steam, which I will not put into this development budget because I'm cheating. And you put it out into the world. If you can convince 69 people to buy this game, you've paid back your entire development budget. Less than 100 people spending $5 to experience a piece of creativity you put out into the world. Yeah, you won't be able to make as much as an Undertale, despite the circumstances being different. You won't be able to make as much as an Undertale inherently, unless some major factor comes into play that completely changes everything. Some fluke of luck. The flukes of luck we all rely on already. But after those 69 copies, you have pizza money. You don't think about getting your Netflix subscription or about renting a movie on a cold night with the people that you care about. It's not cynical, but it is acknowledging that the idea of having pieces of work exist in the world that aren't solely intended to be the fulcrum on which we succeed or fall. That actually sounds kind of rad. And no one is really looking at this field of pizza money. No one's looking at what's the best game you can make for $200, $300, $1,000, or $5,000, because the economic factors and scales in which our industry rests are all directed towards the hit. In an alternate version of this story, you get a budget of $200,000 all inclusive. Launch trailer, development budget, and that meal you had with your publisher in Tokyo when they pitched you to Nintendo. You sell your game at $19.99. You have a much higher earning potential. You have a 30% platform fee and a 30% publisher cut once you've made back your recoup, your essentially bet against the future of the game and how much it can make. It's based off of how most studios operate. It will be your full-time project for 2 to 4 years. You need to sell nearly 15,000 copies to make back that recoup and see a single further dime or benefit from its existence in the world. And you have to see it in enough time that it pays for post-launch support, updates, bug fixes, for you to pay your rent. Because even platforms, the money it takes for platforms to send that money onto you, in the case of any platform you're dealing with, PC or console, you're looking at 1 to 4 months for the first check to come in. So you need to break even so that that first check deals with all of this, that you'll get a first check in the first place. That's terrifying. And if it doesn't work, you could end up shattered. And I think we deserve a version of creativity that doesn't have that, which is why I talk about smaller, better games. Smaller and better is the most self-explanatory pieces of this talk. You have an idea for being an alchemist in an open world environment, collecting potions or potion ingredients, making potions, selling them, and finding your way as a lighthearted alchemist in a fantasy world. That's a big old game. Let's say you condense it. You're figuring out how to be an alchemist in a small town surrounded by a countryside. Condense it again. You're an alchemist working out of a hut in the countryside. People come to you with potions and reagents, and you figure out what to build. You make this thing smaller and smaller and smaller until it fits the shape that fits your life, that fits you, that fits the thing you want to build anyway. Maybe you end up with a game where you're ultimately, via dialogue puzzles, solving riddles, and making potions. That's an exponentially smaller game than the first thing I just talked about less than a minute ago. You can focus on making that thing tight and compelling and the best version of itself to a degree that EA or any other publisher could never even fathom. When you're working at that scale, when you're Electronic Arts, you don't even know what a $300 game looks like. Making a game for $5,000 appears unthinkable. That isn't even the burn rate for a single day for one employee in one of your studios. You have a mobility and an opportunity to operate that the vast majority of your industry isn't even thinking about. And it keeps coming back to I think the most important phrase in this talk title, which is not smaller, better funding or games, but self. The resources you have are your time, your money, your skills, your interests, your knowledge, your collaborators, your existing and future projects. These are the things you have. And you would be surprised how often we ignore fundamental pieces of it. If your interest, you say, I want to make a platformer, when really you're a musician and you want to make hot ditties and bops that you would hear in a platformer you grew up playing, like Mario, or in the 3D realm, Crash Bandicoot, or Diddy Kong, or there's been a lot of platformers. Regardless, you as a musician, what you really want is to make the music that gives you a feeling that those same games did. But the way that it has been projected to you to make that is to first build an entire platformer. So you're dealing with collision bugs and 2D physics and animation sets and character controllers for a 2D action game to get to the piece of your interests and your skills that you actually want to be building. Maybe you have kids. That fundamentally changes the amount of time you can assign to certain things in your life. If your time is entirely taken up by a full-time published project that you have $200,000 on the line for, or a mortgage on the line for, and it doesn't work and it shatters you, that is a detriment, not just to you, but to this industry, because we don't deserve your voice. But we do need it. What does it look like to make a game around that 1 hour you have in the evening all to yourself over 365 days, and to see what game you can make within those constraints, building around the constraints of the money that you can risk without destroying your life, building around the people you know, and even projects you've made in the past, and little bits of code and art that you have pulled from the past to make your next project a reality. These are the it seems self-explanatory, and it seems even a little bit absurd, but these are the resources we ignore all the time. We could be self-funding smaller, better games, de-risking the idea of being a creator. If we focus on making games for a lifetime instead of a living, or making games for a lifetime instead of a living right off the bat. I want to see more games made by people who have been in this industry for 30 years. Because right now, most people burn out around 3. And that doesn't happen unless we fundamentally change the way we see our own resources, we see the projects we're making, and we see the way in which we're making them. The things we're building right now, the things we can build, are unprecedented. We complain about the saturation of our markets with 30 games a day coming out on itch.io or Steam. And that sounds incredible. It sounds stunning. It sounds, how am I going to break out of that? There's over 600 Kindle books released every single day. There is a horde of people on Spotify, musicians who have dedicated their craft to making something interesting, who will never be listened to. You, in the place that you are in right now, are enough. You're worthy to be making video games. And the way in which you can be making them is from a place that prioritizes you instead of risks who you are to build something that for many people will always be unattainable. This isn't a message of pessimism, or at least I hope it isn't. It's one of optimism. It's one that says, instead of having hundreds of people clawing and dying in the dark so that we can focus on a few stars and follow them and hope to be one of the dozen that succeeds this month, this year. It says we could have thousands of people who are maintaining their day jobs, maintaining their lifestyles, maintaining their psychological and physical health, and are making games from within those constraints instead of pushing them to their own destruction. This is possible. It starts with you, with what you have right now today. So I challenge you. I ask you, consider what is the game that you could fund yourself in a year. Consider what's the game that you could make yourself in a year. Maybe you go with a publisher. Maybe you go crowdfunding. None of these things are evil or wrong. I wouldn't even say risking something to get the opportunity for something you love is wrong. But what is wrong is that this is the idea of this being seen as the default for how we live and operate. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing me out. Thanks to Wordplay for having me. Self-funding smaller, better games, just making smaller, better games. Making games that fundamentally don't destroy us and that can reach a global audience is within our grasp, more so now than ever, and this might be the last slice of time in which that is so possible and is the way in which video games function. So while it's here, while you're here, I'm glad you're here. And it's an opportunity. The opportunity of making things without destroying yourself is one you deserve to have. Without further ado, I've been Oliver Nelson Jr. Self-fund and make smaller, better games. I believe you can do it. And it's what I'm doing right now. It seems to be going pretty well. But if it all falls apart, I'm not going to fall apart with it. I think that's the best piece of this of all. Until next time, I can't wait to see what you create.
I can't do this anymore.
Nothing I can do to change your mind.
Now you are welcome to try. I believe I made myself clear.
You know, I feel like we've had this conversation a couple of times now, and you still don't seem to get that I'm done with this line is just gonna look really silly at the end of the day.
Wow, this tastes like a wonderful winter day where you step out on your porch and smell the aghast snow and pine train tracks.
The Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali wrote the following lines as farewell. At a certain point, I lost track of you. You needed me. You needed to perfect me. In your absence, you polished me into the enemy. Your history gets in the way of my memory. Thank you to everybody at Wordplay for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk about interactive fiction and about folk theatre and the possibility of an evocative resistance against hegemonic oppression. I do not want to anticipate the talk, but as an introduction, I want you to know that I'm speaking from a small town in India, and that a lot of what I will speak about was written in response to several occurrences in my country and depredations that its people are still being subjected to. But I do believe that in interrogating colonialism, language, and historiography, one is bound to include ideas that will find resonance with many a people across the globe who suffer under some form of racial, economic, or political inequity. So bear with me as I try and weave together a sprawling argument across the legacy of colonialism, the bureaucratic tyranny of citizenship, and the relationship of individual identity and collective histories, all the way into contemporary political protest and the role of hypertext in the performance of dissent. I'm going to speak of detentions, confinements, language, the internet, rebellions, violence, migrations, and the waning promise of plurality in a modern state. But most of all, I want to speak about interactive fiction as an extension of theatre, where it may be possible to imagine the performance of democracy without the burden of nationhood. You might argue that a lot of what I'm going to speak about is tainted by my distrust of the nation state as an absolute model of self determination and autonomy, and you would be right. But it is precisely at that point of distrust that I want to posit the argument that hypertext is perhaps the first methodical repudiation of the tyranny of the printed word and the written ideal, and its absurd and simultaneous form opens up all manner of fascinating political consequences. It is a suitable time to think of confinements. I'm an author of interactive fiction, and the medium of my choice is very sensitive to the use of verbs which chart the position of a body within the space of a story. So it is with great horror and not inconsiderable fear that I have witnessed a continuous and brutal withdrawal of bodies from public spaces and private imaginations in my country, as dissenters are forced into prisons in retaliation for opposing the whims of power. To bind a body in confinement is to bind it to the most limited definition of itself. It is to make the body a single and rigorously contained entity devoid of a landscape and devoid of society. A prisoner, after all, is an ideal citizen subject to the extent of space that a state decides is sufficient for its existence. No confinement is ever dignified, and each seclusion is the moment that suspicions between an authority and its people calcify into territories and margins and into the walls of containment. To those unfamiliar, I speak of the barricading of Kashmir, when my country became a colonizer of its own people and of its own state, and subjected a portion of its own population to the rule of one of the most heavily militarized zones on the planet. I speak of retaliations against those who protest a government which is excluding and including citizens to curate for itself a republic that is as willing to forget uncomfortable truths as it is to defend unfortunate lies. And in a most remarkable example of the deep suspicion between the state and its denizens, I speak of the detention of poets, students, professors, reporters, lawyers, and human rights activists who are being held under draconian anti-terror laws in my country which allow people to be imprisoned without bail or even the recourse of a trial. I enumerate these violent instances of authority so that you can fully apprehend the fact that I talk to you amidst a degree of political, religious, and doctrinal violence perpetrated on fragile bodies and fragile communities that is scarcely to be imagined. And it is amidst such fear that I find the very mandate of a generous history being violently and systematically repudiated. Fear, after all, is the precise scale on which to trace the contours of belonging. How afraid you are as a citizen, and how tenuous your claim to a society is measured by the extent of your transgressions against the imagined boundaries of a nation. So when I speak of fear, I speak of the fear of those who inadvertently imagine a history beyond a single dominant narrative of our past. I speak of the fear born of state-sanctioned violence and a proxy conflict conducted beyond the shrinking border of our collective attention span. I speak of a violence that happens to the others in the darkness of some internet blackout and in the vapid confines of a refugee camp or a detention center. A violence that happens to those who dare defy the unifying mandate of our times, to those who dare to challenge their lands being taken, their languages appropriated, their bodies exiled, and their stories apportioned, to those who dare to attempt a record of their meager lives in the grand traditions of our collective modern history. I speak of the fear felt by storytellers and chroniclers from places of entangled heritage who reject the rule and narrative of the majority, places and people who have now become embattled sites of perpetual conflict, where the mere act of believing in and espousing the possibility of a plural and inclusive record of our lives has become a form of rebellion. And amidst this vilification of dissent, there is an erasure of margins, boundaries, and bodies, a truncation of people into prescribed identities, beings of a nation, beings of a clan concocted from arcane biometric processes, identities that are only to be had by belonging to a territory, belonging to a database, belonging to a country that will not have you unless you declare yourself perpetually grateful to be allowed within its walls. Amidst such fear, I ask, is it possible to author a generous history of our lives? This fear that we speak of, this fear which has pervaded all facets of interaction between a state and its population, is amplified tremendously by the supple allowances of spirited streams of data that surround us and create a repeating world of digital mirrors. I speak, of course, of the internet, the endlessly replicated nodes of discrete and generated data that contain not just a capacity for information but also proliferation, a repository that has been taught to remember but not allowed to forget. In lives marked by a calendar of circular time, repetitions have long been the principal source of legitimization and truth-making. So it is no wonder that the extraordinary duplication of the internet should thus overwhelm our faculty of being able to delineate truth from propaganda. But the internet is a medium of thought and communication so germane to the performance of existence today that its access is a fundamental right and its withdrawal a bodily harm. Or to put it simply, the underlying grid to all our modern digital modes of communication, even when they appear to be visual, is the hypertext. The promise that no piece of data is secluded and no fragment of information unsearchable. Hypertext is the stage on which the theatre of our public lives is now conducted and the state in which a memory of our performance recorded. It is the agnostic medium of propaganda that can inspire the faithful to violence by endlessly repeating its imagined truths to those of us who are most susceptible, and it is the medium where once attained this violence is flattened into putrid images that are witnessed and ignored without remark or recollection. If we examine this extreme form of witnessing, of documenting and capturing and abstracting and fixing into data sets all the tragedies and depredations of modern statehood, if we examine the algorithmic parade of horrors turned into political arguments, we discover that there is malice here in our inability to bear actual witness and in our withdrawal from the responsibility to confront the tyranny of a weaponized medium that once held democratic promise. And amidst such dislocation from the action of resistance and such gentrification of dissent, I ask again, is it possible to record a generous history of our lives? I recognize that to hope for a plural history today is a quixotic proposition, but I believe there has to be a way to reconcile our past without the fear that it will irrevocably alter our present. There has to be a way for stories to live and be spoken and heard without the dread of complete loss and ostracization. For we belong to our past, and it is here, in between the now present and the now past, that an attitude of skepticism towards the grand histories and meta-narratives of our age must be made to exist. And it is here that we have to draw a line and refuse the complete capitulation of one of the most powerful sites of democratic performance. It is here, and it is now, that we need to reclaim hypertext and enrich it with a vocabulary of temperance rather than give in to its most vile and virulent forms. From here onwards, I will be using the term hypertext interchangeably with forms of modern fiction that employ hypertext as a model of authorship and data organization. And thereby, for the purpose of this talk, I will obfuscate the use of the term with the broader project of authoring interactive fiction and other forms of aquatic literature, even ones that may not apparently share the interconnected premise of hypertext, simply because they all challenge the implicit authority of authorship in very similar ways. I believe that hypertext in its purest form is the first methodical repudiation of the tyranny of the printed word, the inconstant, simultaneous, entangled reminder that all fiction is susceptibility itself. Especially when history, and often immediate history, is being ruthlessly deployed to create rigid boundaries, efface people and places, and to prop up governments based on the written word, the linear page, the archaic printed ideal, there is a grave and urgent need to delegitimize the project of an archive and to pollute the record of authority. There is an urgent need for a pirated history of our times, and it can only be written as hypertext. After all, we know that each hegemonic age is accompanied by an obliteration of lived histories and local memories of customs and rituals and dialects of stories and inheritable knowledge, and that under any authority, be it colonial or fascist, nationalist or fundamentalist, some stories from the fissures of gender and identity, from the fissures of place and caste, will simply not be told until the violence of their recollection and the absurdity of their form is not somehow accommodated in the method of their telling. I mean a coherent and temperate form of authorship, where each argument or opinion, each protest or provocation has to be told within the prevalent mores of the people you want to reach. And interactive fiction might just be an ideal medium to do so. Because interactive stories are delightful and democratic. For it is through play that one can tell fractured stories, tales that puncture time and are barbed with notes and interjections, material stories, physical stories, geological and temporal stories, stories where a reader is assured that their actions within the simulacrum will not cause lasting material or temporal consequences to the world around them. A place where conventions of society are held in momentary abeyance and you are allowed to falter as you reason. A site of record where the author is always, at least in part, the player herself. In lieu of the storyteller, we have the player. In lieu of the audience, the player. As a character from the story, it is the player once again who embodies these roles. And suddenly, in our method of telling stories, which has not altered significantly for a millennia, there is room between authorship and enactment. A capacity for the reader, or rather the player, to probe the author's writings. And if the writings are incomplete and history is unrecorded, then play can help simulate lost interactions, not reanimating or recollecting histories, but at least acknowledging the extent of the void in our understanding and helping decolonize the rest of the narrative around it. I want to pause here for a moment and speak at a tangent about another tradition of storytelling. And to better understand it, let us travel back to 1858 and the collapse of the rule of the British East India Company, a private enterprise that had enriched its coffers and bolstered European wealth over 100 years of untold looting from the subcontinent, and had now bankrupted itself in the exploitation and conquest of vast swathes of territories, and in defending against a sepoy rebellion that threatened their very hold over the colony of Hindustan. When the excesses of the company eventually jeopardized the intricate web of economies and trade across Europe, the colony of India was absorbed into the British Crown under the Government of India Act of 1858. And suddenly, faced with the unenviable task of governing a bafflingly diverse population that spoke hundreds of different languages, practiced at the intersection of dozens of different religions, and were bracketed across multiple, simultaneous, and peculiar local, geographic, caste, racial, historical, cultural, and lingual identities, the colonial government crafted the first imprint of the modern project of citizenship, essentially turning the colony into a fertile laboratory to experiment with the limitations and possibilities of the nation-state as a model of governance. It was a project that was to lead to a codified set of identities that locked people into categories that seemed reasonable to the European overlords, and an erasure of countless individual and vernacular histories. At its extreme, this fundamental lack of imagination and generosity in the understanding of intersectional identities led to one of the worst migrations and massacres of people in the 20th century during the partition of India and Pakistan. But even at its most nascent form, it bred a fundamental distrust between the citizen and the government, a distrust born out of mutual bewilderment and fear. And it is here that we find a wonderful and eclectic tradition of anti-colonial protest, because it happens to be located precisely at the point of discomfort between the definitions of a state and the desires of an individual. I'm speaking of the tradition of street theatre, or the Nukkad Natak, of folk theatre practices like the Notanki and Bhawai and Jatra performances that became conduits of a strident anti-colonial movement over the 100 years from 1858 to 1947. A munificent tradition of the subcontinent encompassing several dozen forms of theatre and performance, with each steeped in ideas of disguise, duplicity, intersectional identities, and roleplay. After all, identities are at the heart of any communal truth and any historiographic process, and the revealing of an identity to be recognized by the state as a citizen, while also hiding an identity to maintain solidarity against the state, had become the inevitable dance of citizenship in colonial India as its denizens began to agitate against colonial rule. Here, the very performance of citizenship turned into a pantomime, as it always does when authority or capital or surveillance invades into the most private sectors of our being. And traditions of becoming other people, traditions like Behrupias who were wandering performers who pretended to be different people or animals or characters for entertainment or for sustenance, became the vectors of irreverent political discourse and a collective awakening of political consciousness that led to the tremendous agitations for Swaraj or self-rule, or more popularly known as the Indian independence movement. The insularity of folk theatre, in its recreation and critique of the real world order, certainly enabled its rejection of authority to proliferate unhindered. It was thought to be a banal pursuit, a trivial entertainment, practiced by travelling troops and vagabonds, until it became the locus of some of the most incisive political commentary of the time and spread through all the porous borders that the vagabonds, as stateless citizens, were allowed to pass through. But most of all, the one structural conceit that allowed the medium to become a powerful tool of protest was its redaction of authorship. Any folk theatre performance added actors and interlocutors between the writing and the staging of a story, and this simple addition created room to provoke and criticize and to inform and challenge, and promulgate, celebrate, and remember the story a little bit differently each time. Most folk performances were based on familiar forms or myth-based stories, and were conducted by a sutradhar, a holder of threads, or a narrator, who here eclipsed the author in how the play was restructured to suit different audiences or other local concerns. Often inveigling into the main telling of the story a bric-a-brac of local flavor and regional concerns, sometimes defeating gender stereotypes, sometimes enforcing the word of a local patron, other times inserting subliminal messages inspired by a bhakti poet or a popular Sufi saint, and eventually, as the anti-colonial movement intensified, as fonts of popular political mobilization and organization. All hypertext, I would argue, is beholden to this ancient practice of reinterpreting authorial intent, where the stories are written by nobody or everybody, and where the author is replaced by an ever-changing sutradhar in the form of a reader, a player, a redactor, an actor, creating stories without authors. Because it is in this redaction of authorship, this particular abrogation of authority, which makes many a folk tales and forms of street theatre, protest songs and songs of labor, or etiological tales and myths delightful, disaggregated, inclusive methods of record, tools of dexterous cunning, tools of elliptical time and of repetitions, or tools of what we like to call concentric fictions. Fictions found in various forms and adapted to various tellings in various seasons and various purposes, and the only narratives that can recollect the violent, volatile, and contested histories of our time in a surprising and sympathetic manner, and confer upon us a negotiated and plural sense of belonging that a nation itself can never grant. And here the legacy of folk theatre becomes apparent. A game, after all, is the apotheosis of becoming somebody else. A form of being that makes it evident that all truths and identities are always assemblages, uncomfortably put together ever-changing collages of ideas about who we are allowed to be and who we once identified as. And to be complicit in the creation of such multitudinal identities is the simplest way of ensuring that power or authority has a limited role to play in the record of our lives. And it is in search of such sites of future plurality that we try to practice, for we believe that to confront history is to know that our ability to remember has been polluted, to discover that there is an infection of certitude and a weakening of privilege, because any single history is always a vacuous record, and it is these endless perforations in memory which make all history bearable. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's talks, but Wordplay isn't over yet. Come back tomorrow for more talks from more game creators. In the meantime, please head over to handyesociety.com, play some of the showcase games. They're amazing. Really just support those creators. They're doing fantastic work. Until then, stay safe, wear a mask, and I'll see you all tomorrow.